Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our COP26 Solutions discussion series, this time around nature. My name is Ed Glucksman, and I'm based at the University of Exeter on their Penryn campus in Cornwall, and I'm a lecturer in the business school, as well as a clean growth and net zero partnerships manager, the latter role I'm just phasing out of actually after COP26. So we're here about a week and a half before COP26 starts in Glasgow. I think all of us in this virtual room are involved in one way or the other. The IES has already covered certain key topics and has done a lot of work, like many other organizations across the country, preparing for COP26. And so we're here today to speak about the topic of nature and nature-based solutions, and we have a fantastic set of speakers with us today, representing a range of organizations, and I'd like to ask all of you to introduce yourselves, your organization, also your relation to the IES, as well as what you'll be doing for COP26. So let's kick off over to you, Stewart Cocker.
Good start. Hello, morning everybody. Yeah, my name is Stewart Cocker. I work for Epsom Borough Council in Surrey. I've been working for them for over 30 years. Started as a ranger, worked my way up, and still guess working, as I like to say, a little bit at the coal face. So contributing in that way, and hoping that this morning, possibly that length of time, working for a local authority, which I do believe local authorities have a big role to play in delivering what's expected with all the talk about nature and the Environment Bill, etc. So yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Stewart. And over to you, Mark Everard.
Well, good morning. Yeah, I am actually Vice President of the Institution of Environmental Sciences. As one of my hats, I've got lots of hats. So I'm just going to talk about three of them today. I'm a consultant in ecosystem services, international development, or at least was before we couldn't do international stuff anymore. And I'm also a fractional associate professor at the University of West of England, associate professor of ecosystem services. So I'm very interested in nature's functions, which hopefully will be useful for this webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Over to you, Tom Butterworth of WSP.
Thank you so much, Ed, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So yeah, my name is Tom Butterworth. I'm a technical director in WSP. WSP is a large engineering consultancy, about a third of our business being environmental specialists. So perhaps environmental engineering is a way of thinking about it. I am deputy head of our ecology team here in the UK and trained as an ecologist, and lead our work on biodiversity and natural capital, which is a growing area of work for us at the moment, rapidly growing. So yeah, that's who I am and what I do.
Thank you very much. And finally, over to you, Tim Goodwin of Ecology Solutions Limited.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I know Tom quite well. I run probably one of the largest independent ecology firms. I, for my sins, spend my life at public inquiries, being cross-examined by barristers, probably do that more than any other ecologist in the UK. So I'm at that very hard-nosed end of trying to get planning permission for clients, but in a sound way. So that's me in a nutshell.
Fantastic. Thank you to all of you, and thanks for taking the time to be here this morning. It's great to have a range of industries, of sectors represented here today. So first question I'd like to open the discussion with is really quite a broad one, which is, how do we take nature-based solutions from rhetoric to reality? How do we, as practitioners, mobilize these nature-based solutions? What are you doing in your jobs, and how will that probably evolve into the future? should we start maybe with Tom Butterworth and the consultant's perspective?
Yeah, okay. So there's a, how do we get nature-based solutions into the work of a development or an organization that we're working with? It's a really important question. I think there's a lot of work that goes on looking at trying to enhance biodiversity for its sake, and I think that's really important and really valuable. So that's shouldn't be put to one side. But alongside that, alongside the targeted interventions that are around, I don't know, supporting some high quality biodiversity areas that lots of businesses want to be seen doing, want to be doing. Alongside that, there is an increasing recognition that there are significant risks to businesses arising from the natural environment and significant opportunities for those businesses arising from the natural environment that at the moment, most businesses are ignoring. Whether that be impacts on flood relief, we do quite a good job on thinking about that, but there are impacts to their supply chain, their value chain, as well as direct impacts on their staff that are starting to now become much clearer. And so one of the things that we try to do is open that up. Yeah, not to terrify people, but rather to help people make informed decisions, to help businesses, whether it be a development company or a local authority or a water company, understand the risks to their businesses, understand how they can manage those, and then understand how they can use nature to resolve those risks and deliver benefits. Because that's the other point. Understanding the risk is one thing, but the next step is knowing how they can use those natural systems to decrease that risk, to translate that into an opportunity. And that, I'll stop there because that opens up a huge piece on, well, how do you actually do that?
Yes.
But risk and opportunity, understanding environment as a risk to their business is often the starting point.
So if I could follow up with a question there, it would be, you know, how do you actually do it as a consultant? Is this the product, quote unquote, that you sell to a client, or is this something that you actually tack on to existing projects that they come to you with? How do you actually get people to think about this?
Well, the answer to that is both. So lots of clients will come to us with a project, let's say a road scheme or a housing development. And if it's a housing development, they may well have requirements to put in place green space. They may well have requirements under the Environment Bill coming through for biodiversity net gain. They'll also have requirements to manage flood waters, flood risk. There'll be water quality issues as well. And we've seen a lot of those coming through over the last little while, challenging and creating challenges for development. And so they're coming with these challenges already there. They're already in play. What we can do is open those up and understand how and set out how we can put in place sustainable urban drainage, use the areas of green space to both enhance biodiversity, improve air quality, and so on. Looking at these multiple benefits. It's not rocket science, and it's also not new. We've been talking about green infrastructure for a long time. I think what is new is that there's a recognition within the businesses that this is real, that it hits the bottom line. And with the evidence from things like the Dasgupta review, with some tools that have been developed, whether it be the nature tool that we've developed or the EBN, that's the environmental benefits from nature tool that the government have produced, there's tools to allow us to articulate those impacts, those opportunities, and start to think about how that impacts on the business's bottom line.
Great, thank you very much. And that's the same thing we're doing here at the University of Exeter. We have a series of tools, especially looking quite locally so that people understand what's happening on their doorstep and how it's relevant to the global picture. So thanks for that. And while speaking about our local environment, if we could go over to you, Stewart, and ask you a little bit from your perspective, how you see taking nature-based solutions from rhetoric to reality.
And it might actually be useful just to describe to you the meeting I've just come from, actually, which So at a local authority level, there's tremendous pressure, and it's becoming quite political, to plant trees. And you've got folks like myself, Borough Tree Officer in Epsom Ewell. We're very aware of lack of resources, and that's time, not just money. But also fundamentally, we're also very aware that in a small borough like Epsom and Ewell, we've worked out using the national tree map actually, that even if the whole borough was forested, we wouldn't be getting anywhere near sequestering the amount of carbon that the borough emits in a year. I think it's something like 2016 figures, 250,000 tonnes. And I think the borough of totally forested might be somewhere around 12,000 tonnes a year. And it just highlights, we've got valuable habitats, we've got chalk grassland, we've got pasture woodland, we've got hay meadows, all of which some people looking on Google Maps might think, oh, what a great place to plant trees. So we're at the moment trying to get the message across that, yes, we can plant trees, but we're angling it towards the biodiversity crisis, looking at green infrastructure, habitat connectivity, and promoting it in that sense, but not just so almost greenwashing and saying, look at us, look what we're doing for climate change, and trying to get people to really understand that it's their boiler that's important and what they drive that's important. And we're coming up against, I was meeting today, was head of planning, a director, 2 senior councillors, and I mean, it's good. There's a great degree of agreement, but it's working out how we're going to communicate this to the public and still be seen to be taking action. So to illustrate that, we've also come under pressure for grass verges, and we've tried to turn that around and say, look, we as a council, we have hay meadows, we have conservation grazing, we have chalk grassland management. We don't actually have that much road verge. We prioritise in that way. And we're thinking with trees actually communicating a similar message. This is what we actually do, and we will be doing some tree planting, but it will be for these reasons. So it's for us, it's really topical actually. How do you actually take this rhetoric and apply it on the ground?
Thank you very much. That's really interesting and great to hear also that you're responding also to the, I guess to the public in a way. So. Really very interesting to hear. How about you, Mark Everard? You've got multiple hats on, as you suggested. From your perspective, how do we make nature-based solutions a reality? What are you doing at the moment, and what works, what doesn't?
Well, I think I'll sort of tackle that in 3 chunks, really, if I may, which is non-industrialized societies do use nature-based solutions. They don't think of it in those terms. We did until industrialization. I mean, in India, I've been working to sort of document some wonderful food and water practices, the principles behind them, their restoration as they're abandoned, but also what the hell does that mean for us? You know, there's people doing it that don't realize they're doing it. So there's learning from the developing to the developed world. We often think the knowledge has to flow one way, but in this instance, no, we've got so much to learn from people who might be ostensibly illiterate, but have so much wisdom. So we did live like that, and then we industrialized, and then we technologically dealt with issues on a very fragmented basis. And that's our problem, that we don't systems think, which is my 3rd point. But just to get to the 2nd point, I've been running a program called Reconnecting Society with its Ecological Roots. And that's really to recognize how nature-based solutions underpin all policy areas. So, we've had breakthroughs with natural flood management and green infrastructure for urban flooding, air quality, the livability of cities. And even, these green corridors for flood and for air and for noise and for visual buffering as green transport routes. But, I'm doing some work also with, what's the direction of sustainable agriculture? And it's very sort of fractured, the literature. There are those that think hyper-intensification is the way to go, more tech. And there are those that say soil quality is the underpinning, which it absolutely is. But to feed 7.9 billion today, rising to 9.5 billion on dwindling resources, we actually have to hybridize those systems. So to recognize, for example, a technical solution like a dam to feed a city, where you need a good nature-based solution to get the dam to fill with good water quality to start with. So actually the world we live in that might seem very technocentric actually already embeds a lot of nature-based solution. It's just we've kind of overlooked it, and if we overlook it, we tend to liquidate it. They did some work with the MOD as well about the role of water in peacemaking and securitization. Because if you take away competition for a contested resource, then you can bring about peace or remove the spark for conflict. In fact, I told the MOD, did you realize that your 30-year global strategic trends report, looking out 30 years at strategic security risks, mentions water 228 times? And they said, really, does it? So nature-based solutions are there in our technocentric world, and we need to elevate them. And then I get to my third point, which is that we need to do so systemically. Because let's take an example, a very current example, the way developers are rushing towards wetlands for nutrient neutrality, but ignoring all of the other things that wetlands can do. So we end up with very technical wetlands that aren't really wetlands in a functional sense. Yes, they can mop up a few nutrients, but what about their contributions to hydrological neutrality at catchment scale, carbon sequestration, ecological roles in terms of, use directly and as stepping stones through landscapes, their aesthetics. So we need to be systems thinkers to look at benefits and disbenefits, beneficiaries and victims on a systemic basis. And we have tools to do this. I mean, with my colleague, Rob McInnes, we developed the RAWS tool, Rapid Assessment of Wetland Ecosystem Services, which was accepted by Ramsar Resolution in October 2018 as a systemic way of looking at the values, in this instance, of wetlands. It's just that we're not very good at systems thinking as a technocentric society and with siloed policy areas. So systems thinking is absolutely the way to go, to recognize that nature just doesn't do one thing well, it does many connected things well, and we need to value them.
Really important. Thanks, Mark. It's so important to recognize the complexity of these issues and also all the different stakeholders that would be involved in the solutions. And on that note, actually turning over to you, Tim, you have a lot of experience, several decades worth of experience working with ecological planning, but also it seems through your experience, you have expertise as well, also in the legal aspects of this. And so what will it take really to turn nature-based solutions then from rhetoric to reality from your perspective, and also, of course, as a private sector leader?
Okay, for me, I think the single biggest thing to change is really one of what I describe as being negative rather than being positive. So the sort of, as I sort of call them, I suppose, in inverted commas, and I've worked both internationally and in the UK in conservation, but I tend to call them the conservation lobby. Everything has been about minimums or having to. There's never a positive to that. So Tom mentioned a few minutes ago the new Environment Bill. It was in the Commons yesterday. A number of the amendments that the Lords made were knocked out. From my point of view, that was an excellent decision. But look at, in terms of biodiversity, what is the bill actually going to do? Now, it's taken a very unique way forward in that regard, in that it's going to, by statute, place a planning condition on each permission, which requires you to deliver a biodiversity gain. At the moment, that's been set at 10%. So a development should leave the environment in a better state after the development's been built than where it currently sits. But for me, that's still negative. That's still how the conservation lobby think. What's the incentive for a developer to do 11%, or 15% or 20% or 30%. There isn't, because he gets his planning permission as long as he hits the minimum. The single easiest thing to have done was to have either through the Environment Bill and place it into statute, or by changes to national planning policy. You could have had, in the same way as currently within national policy, there is a presumption in favour of sustainable development. Why not make it an assumption that you will get your planning permission if you're delivering significant biodiversity gains? So that's what I see as being positive. We're always on the negative, and that means that developers, if I was a developer, I would probably deliver the minimum that got me across the line. Why would I want to do more than that? So, you know, there are developers out there. I spent 2 days on the stand yesterday at a public inquiry where the only argument was about, in real terms, the biggest topic from my perspective was biodiversity net gain, where that client is delivering about a 30% net gain. And I had conservation lobby on the other side arguing that it didn't deliver 30% net gain. It just seems to me there needs to be a fundamental shift from, as I say, negative policies and negative thinking to rewarding positive thinking to get the most and get this from just a sort of a theory into reality on the ground. So for me, that's the biggest change that I would want.
Well, thank you very much. And that's really interesting about the framing, especially if we're talking about the same issue, but from different angles and the effect that has. To move on slightly, but actually really interesting your words there, Tim, in this respect as well. I'd like to speak a little bit about offsetting and nature and how that can be used to support our response to climate change. So this ties in very much with what you just said, Tim, I think, the framing around the offsetting arguments and what we've seen so far in the UK. Why don't you start us off, actually, and since you've already laid the foundations for this, how should offsetting in nature be used then to support our response to climate change, do you think?
Yeah, I suppose I'm going to come back with the same things. You know, Mark mentioned a minute ago about nitrate neutrality. If you haven't caught up, the latest one now is water neutrality. I'm sure Tom's already hit that several times in his position. But, you know, how do we get to something that deals with those issues, which ultimately all add up towards, you know, the biodiversity crisis or the whole system of making it work rather than not making it work? But again, and I'm sorry to sound, I mean, you know, I'm saying let's be positive, and I tend to be the one that is quite negative about what happens with the agencies. And by that, I mean the sort of statutory agencies, whether it's the EA, whether it's Natural England, NRW, whoever it is. You know, water neutrality, that's such an important point for all of us, you know, for the entire planet, not just the UK, but everywhere. But it's within our planning system that gets lobbed in, as I say, as a hand grenade into the whole process. But before anybody's had any kind of chance to understand how we solve it and how we don't solve it. So we've now got a moratorium in southern waters areas, so the sort of Sussex and across slightly from that, Hampshire. We're getting the same over in the Broads. We're getting the same up in Chester and Cheshire, where actually development is now being ground to a halt. There is no development going forward. So how do you actually pay for the things that we need? We still need a thriving economy. We still need to generate money, but we need to generate it in a proper way. So for me, yeah, throwing in the problem is one thing, but throwing it in to the point where everything grinds to a halt, to me, does more damage than actually trying to work together to solve those problems, rather than these stop-start approaches to everything. So again, dialogue. Why do we not have more of a dialogue? I know there's us on this call today, but when do the agencies, when do people like Stewart, where do people like Mark, people like me or Tom from consultancies ever really get the chance to be debating that and actually come up with real solutions to the whole process, rather than it's, to my mind, being left to organisations that either don't have those skills, or to civil servants and politicians who are acting on sound bites of what they think. So, let's be honest, the Environment Bill has come forward very much driven, certainly the biodiversity part of it, because of the conservation lobby. Now, that's great in one sense, but because the conservation lobby, to my mind, only ever think about minimums and negatives, I don't see how we move those broader issues like water neutrality into something more positive.
Well, then, thank you, Tim. And at risk of being provocative, I mean, is there simply an accessibility issue here for the information? I mean, I noticed that the entire panel is male. I don't know what the IES membership is like, but is there a communications problem, like you say, in terms of the framing? Is there a deeper accessibility problem into these issues that can also just frame how we discuss all this, of which offsetting is, of course, one of the key points. Mark Everard, I saw you writing furiously, taking some notes. So what are your comments on offsetting in nature and how it can support climate change? Where do you think the challenges are at the moment?
Okay, well, do we start with the mitigation hierarchy, or do we start with offsetting? And that's a pretty fundamental one for me. The mitigation hierarchy: avoid, minimize, restore, and then you get to offset. I think we've seen too often in the past that offset is the easy one. We certainly saw it with the early days of carbon markets. And it's potentially problematic for a number of reasons, but the principal one is it displaces solutions from problems. So in other words, we do what we did before and sort of really pay guilt money to somewhere else. That brings a number of issues to play. One of them is international and intergenerational inequity. The other is the dangers of marketizing nature, so that we just buy one bit of ecosystem service, be that biodiversity support or be that hydrological function or carbon storage. And we don't value nature. We don't value what nature does. We just buy a bit of it and are fairly naive to how the solution affects ecosystems in a very integrated way. I'm seeing this with BNG at the moment, biodiversity net gain. I've got a PhD student who's doing it on a site that I think Tim knows. And if you improve the biodiversity by building in regionally important habitats, you end up with zero BNG because you take away a little bit of habitat that's already there. And the only way we could get BNG to be positive on that case was to pretend the habitat was rubbish to begin with. So what is the win? This PhD student is also taking an ecosystem service approach, and we're finding that there's potentially significant ecosystem service enhancement, but that's a little beyond where we are. So are we starting with a mitigation hierarchy, or are we just paying guilt money? And that relates obviously to the nutrient neutrality, hydrological neutrality, wetlands as a reeds in a box solution versus a genuine ecosystem solution. Secondly, just turning that deliberately to explicitly to climate. Stewart made the very good point that climate is an issue for all policy areas. So it's not just an issue for those that care about carbon. It is to do with flooding, it's to do with farming, it's to do with food security, biodiversity, transport, livability, energy, business, etc. And I was sort of very pleased to see on a BBC News report this morning that climate is now being seen as a mainstream security risk issue as well. I think we all know it is, but to have that formally recognised by MOD is very welcome. So I get back again to the multifunctionality of nature. Are we valuing it, or are we just sort of selling off a bit of it, putting money elsewhere to do a little bit of a job, to save us really having to think too hard about being innovative in the way we develop, to really engage with that mitigation hierarchy? Yeah, let me leave it at there. I could lather on for weeks on this.
Thank you. That's fantastic, and it's a really great question. You know, are we actually doing anything, and if so, what and how effective is it? I was back in my doctoral days. I was on a fellowship at POST, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, and had the privilege of writing the post note on biodiversity offsetting back in 2010. And that was the sort of Cameron Clegg Rose Garden, those years, just after actually the Rose Garden. And this was seen as the sort of new future and the way that private sector could get involved and so forth. And there were not so many players at the time. And it's been really interesting to see how it evolves, but actually also hasn't really evolved over the past decade or so, to the point where it's actually operational. Stewart, over to you. From your local council perspective, and what kind of measures are you putting to place relating to offsetting, if any? And if you're not, then what can be done to actually bring them in? Is it something that you think would be effective?
Well, it's something, Tim's mentioned biodiversity net gain in the Environment Bill, and it's talk of the town at the moment. We've just gone through a review, and actually my team has been brought back into planning, having been in planning some years ago with an expectation that we're going to contribute to biodiversity net gain. I have big concerns about the mitigation hierarchy and the practicality of it. We live in a small borough. We have some very large open spaces that make up over a quarter of the land area in the borough, but we're not going to have a huge capacity because these sites are up and running. They're funded, they have management plans. We're not going to be wanting to dig ponds all over the place. We're not going to be wanting to plant trees all over the place. So, and in looking at it in a long-term scale, it could be really difficult. And you can imagine that at some point, offsetting may well creep away from the boundaries of the borough. The other thing is resources with offsetting. I thought it was a good report by the Environmental Audit Committee called Bloom or Bust. And written through that, almost every chapter was, if you're going to do this, you need to resource local authorities properly. And it was in one specific way. It was employing ecologists. There's no hope of delivering biodiversity net gain, I don't think, unless that is acted upon, and pretty quickly as well. And as you can imagine, local authorities are very challenged financially at the moment. But the other thing I was going to say, Tim mentioned about the sort of wider communication issue, which I think is interesting in the sense I sit on Surrey Nature Partnership Biodiversity Working Group. I sit on the Hogsmill Catchment Partnership. They're all great. We're all achieving things, but there are people who don't sit on both groups. And I think it's a question of almost scale. There's just the environment is very wide, as we know, and interconnected, and it's just the practicalities of getting everybody together. It'd be great. I'd really support that approach of getting more people together to discuss these things more widely. But I'm not
agree,
sure.
and that's I think also where organizations like the IES can come in, and their large memberships and voice as a community. So finally, over to you, Tom. From your unique perspective around offsetting, is this something WSP works on? Does it work? And what are your thoughts for the future?
Yeah, okay. There's loads there, isn't there? And so we've been working on biodiversity net gain and carbon I've been working on it since you wrote that paper when I was back in Natural England. But yeah, for the last, I don't know how many other number of years. And I think there's some really important points that come out of this. Firstly, it's really crucial that we see biodiversity net gain against the principles that have been set out by CIEM, IEMA, and Syria, and that the guidance is associated with that, not just the metric. And if we look at those principles, the first one is follow the mitigation hierarchy, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But if we look at those, actually making a measurable change using the metric is 1/5. No, not even that. It's 1/20th. It's half of one of those 10 principles. Get my maths the right way around. So it's a part, and it's an important part, but it's a small part. Now it gets all of the emphasis because that's what is written out in the Environment Bill. But it's really, really crucial that when we're talking about delivering biodiversity net gain, we are talking about that full description. And that means following the mitigation hierarchy. It means considering the whole ecosystems. It means delivering viable ecosystems, not little patches of habitat that aren't going to last. Now, having said all of that, I have seen more avoidance because of the biodiversity net gain metric than I'd ever seen before. Now, that isn't published. It doesn't come out in the final report that, I don't know, whatever highway scheme or whatever piece of development, housing development, has shifted how they're working. But I've seen much, much more over the last 3 or 4 years than I'd ever seen before. And under the present, before biodiversity net gain, as the planning policy was before, most of the impacts we're measuring through biodiversity net gain would have been completely ignored. So is it perfect? No. Is it just the metric? No. Do we need to build more onto that? Absolutely. But is it better than where we have been over the last number of years, where development has just said, well, this isn't a significant effect and we can ignore it? Yes, there's definitely a step forward there, and it's really important to recognize that. And I just want to reinforce 2 other points, if I may. One is the resources. We have seen a massive uptick in the number of ecologists working in consultancies. My team over the last 5 years have gone from 60 to 150. We need to see, the reason for that is because developers and businesses are understanding the importance of that ecological advice. But we need to see that change in local authorities as well. And Stewart's point is absolutely right. We need to see ecologists seen as in the same way as essential as all of the other planners are. Perhaps more important, but maybe I'm biased as an ecologist, because they're actually supporting and the underpinning stuff that supports our society and our economy. We've got a long way to go there, but that's a really important step. And my last point, if I may, this climate change and biodiversity, both of those, the offsetting has got to be the last resort. It's got to be only for the bit that you can't do anything else with, because we physically can't offset everything. We physically can't deal with climate change in that way. And we've had clients come to us and say, can you find this area to plant trees so that we can capture carbon, ignoring the negative impact that they'll have on biodiversity if they plant a ton of conifers all over a piece of land. So we need to help people understand this integration. It's not obvious to everybody, and ecologists need to play a central role in that, I think. Thank you for letting me make 5 points.
So 5 points is excellent. Thank you so much. And I agree completely about the role of ecologists. I've worked as a consultant as well. And I have to say there's the environmental impact bit and the ecologist, but also linking it to the social impacts as well is really very important. Yeah, also absolutely. Totally under the radar at the moment, both domestically, but of course, definitely in international projects, especially in emerging economies. The ecologists and the social specialists are always sort of the last ones to be considered, and they're there often to tick boxes. And we're hoping that changes very, very soon. Well, thanks all of you for your great responses to that question. And we're going to get a little bit more specific even now, because what I'd like to know is really about specifically what land should be spared for nature. So what land should be spared for nature, and what could be shared to secure multiple benefits So how do we identify the places that we are going to use in these programs?
I think the first thing is this issue of land sharing versus land sparing is just sort of naively a naive dichotomy. We need to think of multifunctionality of land and take sharing or veering towards sharing more of a default. It's inherent in the mitigation hierarchy. If we're talking about sparing, well, we take a sparing approach, we're almost sort of saying, let's go straight to offset, really. Now, we in the UK are in a densely populated nation, so we don't have a lot of wilderness like, you know, North America does. So we are pushed towards sharing, whereas the US veers more towards sparing because of its different geography. Interestingly, Japan is more dense than us, but because of its geography, a lot of it is spared because you can't build or farm there. If you've ever been to Japan, you'll know that. So it's down to how much spare ecosystem we have to deliver the services that underpin the future. But, you know, with 7.9 billion people on this earth today, and we've probably got another 2+ pairs of feet stamping all over the earth between now and 2050, subsisting on a depleted and declining resource base. And we're not talking stationarity here. We're talking about, you know, a downward slide, sharply downward sliding ecosystem resource base. So the idea that there is some mythical away, some place that we can spare to carry on living largely unreconstructed is unhelpful. It raises massive issues of international, regional, and intergenerational equity. So that's my first point. Multifunctionality and sharing should be a sort of default. I get to the second point, which is a contradiction to the first one, but yes, we must spare or restore the most multifunctional. And this cuts to the fact that we have a very substantially depleted and declining inheritance of ecosystems, natural resources. And some of those sites we've designated as Natura 2000 or other sites of perceived priority. But we need to think beyond single metrics like biodiversity or geodiversity, rarity, and think more in functional terms. What do those ecosystems do? Are we assessing them functionally, or are we assessing them in a fairly sort of static way, as if the world isn't changing around them and nature reserves aren't increasingly constrained little fenced areas in trashed landscapes? So connectivity, the kind of Lawton review, John Lawton's 2010 review, bigger, better, more joined up, applies. And that automatically means thinking at landscape scale about functions and joining up the spared resources with better use of the intervening landscapes, nature recovery networks, and all of these things. So yes, we must spare, but we must do it in a functional way, thinking about whole landscapes. The third and final point about this sharing and sparing is more sort of philosophical, really, but important. Sustainability is not enough. In a lot of the common understanding of sustainability, there is a sense of stationarity, as if ecosystems are a fixed asset and we tinker with how we deal with them. But that is not the case. Ecosystems, their ability to support us, are declining very sharply. Just look at some of the major reviews that I'm sure we're all familiar with. So we have to go beyond static sustainability thinking towards regenerative thinking. Now, this is very much at the root of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that we're in now. My book, Rebuilding the Earth, because I like to get my retaliation in before the questions are asked, and the program of Reconnecting Society with its Ecological Roots, where I've tried to sort of argue the benefits of taking an ecosystem base for all policy areas. But we are dealing with rising populations, depleted and depleting ecosystems to support us. So we need to think of the regeneration of ecosystems as foundational capital, which will improve functions, improve services, improve benefits to people multifunctionally between climate, security, food, water, in an integrated way. So just to recap those three, multifunctionality and sharing should be a default. We need to spare the best, but also connect it. And we need to think in regenerative terms beyond that, reflecting the fact that we live in a parlous time in human history.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for bringing your book into the mix as well. And I'm sure our
Christmas,
audience,
the kids will love it.
yes, Christmas presents all around Mark Everard's book. Tim, listening to that, does this tap into what you were saying a little bit about the framing of some of these issues? And in your view, how do we identify what should be spared for nature and so forth, and maybe as a response to what you've heard so far as well? Over to you.
Okay, couldn't agree more with Mark, really. If we sort of wind the clock back a bit, you know, the early people in ecology, or what we now call sort of conservation, and I think it's time almost to move on again from that, but it was all called preservation, wasn't it? I mean, the amount of times that people said to me, you know, what's the difference between conservation and preservation? I've never been an ecologist who believes you put a fence around it and that's what it is. We don't, particularly in the UK, we don't have that luxury of having that amount of land to allow us to do that. And where that led us, exactly Mark's point, was some good areas totally isolated from anything else and having no other function other than just the label, oh, this is a nature reserve, or this is a, you know, and some of the, I know the European regs did a lot of good, but they also pushed the conservation lobby and ecologists generally down this single track route where nobody thinks about these, you know, in some cases, large tracts of land being able to deal with a number of items, whether that is, you know, carbon, whether it's flood storage, whether it's maintaining nature conservation, whether it's recreation. It's always driven us into these isolated pockets. So this little pocket's going to do this, this little pocket's going to do that. So I think Mark is absolutely right to have picked on that multifunctional approach to the process and where we all need to be. I'm just going to jump back one, and I don't want to take the discussion back, but I want to say it just from the point of view of Stewart. Couldn't agree with you more. Every local planning authority should have an ecologist. We don't even have county ecologists anymore in many of the counties. How on earth could you bring forward the kind of strategies we're talking about today, certainly through planning, if there's actually nobody in a planning department who understands the strategy or the value of doing it? So just wanted to say that because I think it's so important. That's, you know, I'm not going to be quite as blunt as Tom was in terms of seeming to promote ecologists absolutely everywhere, but I totally get the situation. So for me, I think is really moving from the old preservation that we had and has gone, luckily, into conservation, but now conservation should be seen in a much broader remit, you know, not just biodiversity. And again, what was the first thing that came out of BNG? We had the formulation by, you know, people who I know actually quite well in terms of the Environment Bank. But was that really the place to go? Because what it meant was, you know, a lot of my clients say, oh, well, let's worry about that, Tim. Just let's buy credits from the Environment Bank. You know, we don't really have to think any deeper than that. And to me, that's the wrong, you know, it is the wrong approach. Now, having said that, and I'll stop after I say this last thing, I've never been a great fan of this hierarchy. And that's because sometimes you can deliver more through restoration or indeed offsetting than you can from avoiding. It does depend on the site. It depends what you've got as your baseline. But how many times do I have a conversation with the few ecologists that are in planning authorities, or indeed with Natural England, who always start the conversation, but that doesn't meet the hierarchy, does it? Well, sometimes it's better not to meet that hierarchy. So it needs to be flexible enough to work. So they're my thoughts, but very much agree with where Mark was coming from.
Thank you, Tim. Really interesting to hear your perspective on it. And I think now perhaps, Stewart, have you had the chance to digest a bit what you've heard and how you would phrase a response to this?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I read the question, my first reaction was that where it impacts somebody like myself, now working in a planning department, is green infrastructure and habitat connectivity. And then having worked in open spaces, obviously it's land that's shared, and you recognise the importance. There are issues with sharing land, but most of them are surmountable. And the other aspect to fairly urban areas like this, when you share open spaces well, I think you actually do impact on climate change, because people tend to stay nearer to home. So there's a lot of value in going down that approach. But in terms of green infrastructure, that's a real challenge for us, because of the pressures. We're a borough within the M25. There's the pressure on building on greenbelt. And just for people like me, getting a voice across that, yes, that piece of land that used to belong, for example, I can think of one example where some land used to belong to an old hospital that's been redeveloped for housing, and it connects the northern edge of one site, which is a triple SI, to the southern edge of another. And it's something that I know if the planners were left to their own devices, they wouldn't recognise it. And it brings up the issue about ecologists, absolutely. But the other issue that I keep coming across, and it's a hobby horse of my wife, Helen, actually, is that why aren't planners given better training on ecology when they're getting their qualifications? Because sometimes there really are situations I've come across where relatively low level of knowledge would make a huge difference, and I'm just not sure that they're being trained to the right level in that regard.
Thank you. Really interesting, and especially that last point about the training and the certifications. When we think about that as practitioners, Tom, finally on this point, over to you, your general thoughts, but also I think you're in a good position to speak a little bit also about what Stewart just mentioned with the training and across WSP and whether that is done at the sort of level that is necessary. Over to you, Tom.
Okay, yeah, so I think it is important. We certainly run that type of training internally for our planners and so on. Interestingly, when I spoke to the senior planners, they said, make sure the training is all there for the junior planners. Don't try and teach us old dogs new tricks. But they did absolutely recognize that it was crucial and really important. And so for that training that we run across our business, yes, ecology is part of that. It's quite a challenge because there's lots of pieces to that they need to look at: landscape, air quality, and so on and so on. The list goes on. And just as we've said, we can't think of any of these things in isolation. And this is why I personally find this sharing debate quite frustrating, or I don't like the terminology. And the reason is that it's absolutely right that we need areas that are primarily doing nature conservation or primarily producing lots of food. But those areas that are doing fantastic nature conservation, there's no reason why they cannot also produce a little bit of food or timber or something, or access to green space, benefits for people. Equally, those places that are primarily producing food, we've got to make sure that they are carbon neutral, not harming biodiversity, not damaging the watercourse, and so are part of a ecosystem that is vibrant and working. So the idea of, I think that narrows down the range that we're looking at in terms of sparing and showing, and create something that underpins that, which is about viability ecologically. And then it's more about, well, where's your weighting sitting? Which of the outputs do you want to put most effort into? Not trying to split it into a tower block versus green space, which I feel would be horrific. We need those, this works just as it works in farming, it works in the urban environment, and just as we've been hearing about green infrastructure. The idea that I don't know, that we separate all of these different functions out would be a mistake, and it would be to the harm of us as humans, I think, as well.
Really great points and great perspective there. It's so interesting to hear the four of you approach this topic slightly differently, and some of the challenges that are coming out, and the sparing versus sharing debate. Personally, also really interesting to hear about Japan and its unique position there, by the way. But I think taking in how we have approached this issue then for the first three sort of main questions, and moving into a sort of final topic of conversation, what aspects would all of you think aspects of our natural environment that are overlooked, which we should consider, that we need to consider as we drive towards change and meet the climate ambitions that are being laid out for us? So specifically, what aspects would be our priority, and also perhaps whether you've already done a little bit of that work before. Does anyone want to volunteer this time to go first? Oh, Mark, you've got your first one with a hand up. This is like being in the classroom again. So go for it, Mark.
Okay, being in a classroom without spreading germs at the moment, that's an issue. We need a paradigm shift to a functional approach. Basically, I mean, our history in the UK is we have a legacy of feudalism. The enclosures or inclosures are acts variously from William I from 1066, distributing land among 180 barons, right through to 1773 and 1914 acts, essentially dispossess people from rights on land. But yeah, so we think in terms of very spatially, in very spatial terms in our culture and in our legislation. But the ownership of land tells us nothing about the functions of land. And the rights to the land's functions don't follow just the physical the physical attributes. So if I, were to completely pave over my garden, I'd contribute to flooding in Wiltshire, but I have a right on my land to do that. So we need to shift that thinking towards functions, because that connects with what the landscape, the development area does. Also, I mean, functions vary over time. They're not rigidly fixed. They change, and they're not tightly geographically bounded in the same way that land ownership is. So yeah, we come from a feudal property owning paradigm. We need to move to think in terms of functions. We need to think in terms of systemic solutions and systemic disbenefits. It follows on from that, because the way we, for example, if I were, which I'm not going to, completely pave my garden, make it impermeable, it would stop it sequestering carbon, it would produce flash flooding, it would remove the biodiversity, I'd have a little heat island and so forth. And that would affect people at catchment scale, at global scale in terms of the climate, and regional scale in terms of the biodiversity. So we need to think in terms of service, not property, overcome our feudal legacy. And the third thing that goes absolutely with that, it's really kind of one at the same, is systemic change in perceptions and regulations of rights. So it follows that the benefits that flow from my land, your land, Ewell's land, wherever we happen to be, have public societal benefit over different spatial and temporal scales. The possessions the possession of land might rest with the owner, but the functional outputs, be their benefits or disbenefits, are for society as a whole. Now, we go back to Kinder Scout, the mass trespass in Derbyshire, of a sort of public uprising to reclaim rights of access, which is in some ways repossessing an ecosystem service that was enclosed in the days of enclosure. But we need to think in those terms, in terms of reclaiming functional benefits that come from ecosystems Otherwise, the presumption will always be that the owner and the developer has rights, and we have to sort of green around the edges of them. There's a paradigm of thinking that much more could be said about it, but that is a foundational answer, I think, to that question.
Thank you, Mark. It is a comprehensive answer, and I think a really good starting point for the discussion on this one. I think I'd like to turn it over to you, Tom. From your perspective, again, what aspects of the natural environment are overlooked? But also, I think because you deal with clients and because sometimes your work is reactive, how can you make that difference as a practitioner?
So I'll answer the second half of that first. The work can be reactive, but it always it's much more difficult to get a result that is both beneficial for the environment and beneficial for the client and society if it is. And as a result, reactive work tends to be more costly. And I hear the point about just going to the Environment Bank to pay for biodiversity gain. That is more costly than sorting it out and avoiding the impacts in the first place. So yes, it is reactive, but actually we're moving to a place where it's becoming much more proactive, which is a really good thing. So we've got housing developers that are engaging with looking at the biodiversity, the ecosystems on site before they purchase the land, not once they've purchased it and then what can they do about it, before they purchase it, and taking that into consideration in the valuation that they put on the land price. Now that is a fundamental change for those developers, but is really, really crucial. And what's driven that? Well, biodiversity and carbon net gain and carbon net zero. So, whatever we think about those things, they are driving changes in behavior that are now considering biodiversity, carbon, and the functional impacts that destroying that habitat will have at a much earlier stage. But to the second point, I completely agree with Mark. I would have maybe talked about it in a slightly different language. I was thinking about the social impacts from development, from farming, from land use, but it's the same point. Yeah, that's the piece that we miss. And interestingly, I find that clients that are public bodies or partly public bodies really want to take this stuff into account and are starting to open that up and think about it, recognizing that they want to have that wider benefit. Yeah, they don't want to be negative, I don't know, Transport for London want to think about how people are moving across London, not just minimizing their carbon footprint. It's also about green transport routes, for example. Yeah, it's also about how that has a knock-on effect to the surrounding ecosystems. And yes, those cities are still ecosystems. And I think that this comes back again. I think some private developers are doing this too, but I think this comes back again to the role of the local authority. And the real challenge we have here with the resources linked to that is that who challenges those developers that ignore this stuff? Well, it's the local authorities. So we need to give them the power to do that because they've got, represent people that are voted in. So it's it's part of our democracy. And they are then charged with overseeing those public benefits, those functional benefits. Now that is quite an expansion of role, but it's absolutely necessary if we're going to meet what Mark's set out.
Thanks, Tom. Really interesting. And fortunately, we have Stewart here to immediately respond to the call for local authorities and also to maybe tell us whether you think that local authorities do have those resources, and if they don't, how can they get them?
Okay, well, it's absolutely central to some of our thoughts at the moment as we look at what the Environment Bill is bringing. The top one is monitoring, because under biodiversity net gain, I believe it's 30-year agreements, possibly with conservation covenants added to keep them going in perpetuity. But who's going to monitor it? There just simply is not currently the in-house resource to monitor it. People might look towards myself and the team that I run, but we're essentially managing local nature reserves, trying to implement a biodiversity action plan. Monitoring over time, I mean, it would start small, but it would scale up, and it would be a huge job potentially in the future to monitor. So a big concern with that, and just I don't know that you need ecologists potentially to do that. But we have it has been talked about in my organisation about the idea of potentially using volunteers in the future to keep tabs on this kind of thing. Whether that's possible or not, I don't know. But we do make a lot of use of volunteers currently. In answer to the question about what gets overlooked, I think possibly on the ground, my experience is some of the natural processes. So, for example, tree planting versus natural succession to woodland, where we know we get a lot more biodiversity bang for our buck going through natural succession, trying to explain to people that when you plant a small tree, it has quite a huge carbon footprint debt that it needs to pay off. Things like that. An area where natural processes possibly are being more taken into account is now flood risk, and that side of things, and going for multiple benefit schemes. But I do think natural succession to woodland is a real key one that's being overlooked at the moment, and there are really good examples around to illustrate the benefits. So, for example, NEP in Sussex is illustrating that. We have a site in our own borough which was heathland in the Second World War, cleared for agriculture and then left for 30 years and is now been turned into pasture woodland with reintroduction of grazing, that side of things. But yeah, I think local authorities are facing a big challenge with the Environment Bill in terms of resourcing and expanding their role, as Tom suggested.
Thank you very much. And really interesting point about the natural succession to woodland down here in Cornwall. This is an ongoing discussion as well. And the university works with Cornwall Wildlife Trust, with Cornwall Council to at least come up with pilot schemes. And based on the climate emergency as well, Cornwall Council have made some big steps in this direction. Tim, over to you. What are your thoughts if we are specific about what aspects of the environment are currently overlooked? What should we be addressing more carefully? What are your thoughts, and also a response to the three colleagues that have just spoken?
Okay, I'm probably going to be slightly controversial, but that's nothing new for me. I'm going to see it from a very different point of view. It might be a bit provocative. First point, whatever has happened to the principle of polluter pays? So let's take this new issue, water neutrality. Farming uses far more water than residential development, but actually all of the discussion is being led through planning, with developers having to pay to deal with that water neutrality, even though their take on it is exceptionally small. And that's just one example. We always seem to, from my point of view, we always seem to just focus on development rather than seeing development in its wider sense, both agriculturally, whether it's timber production, whether it's food production. We never seem to think about that in terms of balancing the books. The balancing of the books only ever seems to come to the development industry. So that's my first big point. Second one, again, quite controversial, I think, and I hope Stewart isn't going to mind me saying, I cringed slightly when you said, it may be that we use volunteers. I've spent my entire career trying to get ecology to be just as important as the lawyer in the room, just as important as the planner in the room, as important as the engineer in the room. Now to do that, I felt the best way to do it was, not fight against it, but actually join it. i.e., I'd go to a meeting and I'd turn up in my pinstripe suit, and people would say to me in my early career, "Are you the lawyer?" And I'd go, "No, I'm the ecologist." And they'd go, "What?" Now, for me, when do you ever get, take the law, when do we ever get volunteers actually being volunteer lawyers? Or when do we ever get volunteer engineers? I can't help feeling that the more we do that, and please don't get me wrong, volunteers within that sector, within the ecology and nature conservation sector, are huge. They do huge amounts of work. But I do think there is a point where we as professionals need to be saying, we are professionals in our own rights. You need to listen to us just as much as anyone else. How many local authorities, we just said, don't even have an ecologist, but when they do, where are they in the kind of hierarchy that gives them the voice? And it's all as well being there, but unless you're a voice that can actually influence things, not an awful lot gets changed. Now, I'm one of probably, not that many ecologists who have been very, very successful, probably more by luck than judgment or anything else. But I know I influence when I turn up to a meeting. People will listen to what I'm saying in terms of whatever aspect that is. But I'd like all ecologists to be in that kind of situation. And if they were, I think half of these conversations that we're having now would just be in a much better position, because we'd be people making real change, driving it from the top, rather than being seen as a sort of under profession. Last point, and it's just to illustrate it, in my early career, you had a lot of landscape practices who would employ one, possibly two ecologists, but you were sat in the corner. And if you were given things to do, but if you voiced an opinion, it was, "Oh, well, you're not a qualified landscape architect." And I have nothing against landscape architects, by the way, either. Engineers did the same. Now, I know Tom is probably better to speak about that, how that works in WSP. But for me, I still feel that there's such a wealth of knowledge out there from ecologists, but often we're just not taken seriously enough to get our voice heard to make the changes. So I hope that wasn't controversial.
Well, I mean, you raise a very interesting point. It's not one that, I feel like it's also being paralleled in the world of healthcare these days as well. And the question then is around ecologists. Do you think that ecologists are seen as, environmental activists rather than just professionals? Or is that what you mean?
Absolutely, yeah. How many times do I hear a client say, "Oh God, no, I don't want to talk to them because it'll all be a disaster. It'll all be, because of their." But I think that's inherent. It's how I started, my contribution to this, was there isn't the right dialogue. People are still on, how many times do I go to a public inquiry? Obviously, it is quite adversarial because there's two halves to it. But, there have been times, and this is an honest example, where I've given evidence on ecology and I've gone over to the ecologist on the other side, whoever that might be, whether it's at the Wildlife Trust or whoever, and people will actually say, "I don't want to speak to you." And I am shocked by that. I might have a different professional view from them, but you wouldn't have two lawyers saying we're on opposite sides of a scheme, but we're not going to talk to one another. Because ecology has always been wrapped up in this country in the nature conservation and in the whole process. So for me, being more professional, looking more professional, being better paid, being seen to be important. And I have these debates with, my own institute, like SCIEM. What has SCIEM ever done to actually promote ecologists in terms of their salaries, their welfare, how important they are? Absolutely nothing, because all they concentrate on is the agenda that's in front of them, not about solving some of the base problems which would give us a bigger voice and a more important voice. And I'll shut up then and let
well, that's
everyone...
a great point, and something also for IES to think about as well, if there are areas where the IES could do more as well to support this. Stewart, you've been pushing your arm up in the air multiple times, so something pressing is coming here.
Well, it was first of all, with regard to volunteers, I fully agree with Tim. Really, you can use they can be used to a certain level, and then it possibly becomes an issue to go above that. But when I just was writing notes before the meeting, one of the things I just doodled down was give nature a home in local authorities, because it is an issue. I've worked in a parks and countryside department, that's gone. I've worked in a street care department, that's gone. I've worked in planning, I've then gone into operational services and then gone back to planning. And given the fact that we now have a global biodiversity crisis, it's very much on the political agenda in local authorities. Maybe the time is coming that you have a planning department, you have an environmental health department, you have a housing department. Maybe you need a nature or biodiversity department. And we could assist. I've actually had discussions with colleagues on this, and I think from a planning perspective, they'd probably find it quite helpful to have in-house expertise that could guide them through, especially based on that point earlier that they seem to feel like they don't have enough knowledge. And it's quite a nice strapline: give nature a home in local authorities. And maybe we're getting close to the moment where that might come onto the agenda, possibly.
Thanks. That's really interesting to hear. And from my perspective, there is also an element of this around training and education. And so, for example, our business school at the University of Exeter, the Penryn campus segment of it, has rebranded itself into the Sustainable Futures Department, which means that students that come here will get an environment and business background during their business school BSc, as it were, over those 3 or 4 years if they go into industry as well. So actually embedding the environmental bit into what are conventionally non-environmental courses may give us a young workforce that has a little bit of background in these issues. This can be, I guess, even more applied. So for example, we have the Camborne School of Mines here on campus as well. Those mining engineers are also getting more environmental and social impact lessons and modules now than they did even 5 years ago. So actually sending young people into the working world with that background might help, and may also give them an appreciation for the environment as a field that you learn, that you are a professional in, and so forth. So potentially that is one way around it. We don't have a huge amount of time left, but I think, Mark, you had your hand up in response to this particular discussion point.
Well, I sort of did. Mainly I was scratching my head, actually. It wasn't a hand in the air, but it does say directly in fact, we've set ourselves a final question in this discussion, and I want to violently agree with Tim as a kickoff to addressing that question about how can we embed science and evidence in our approach to using nature to address climate change. We need a paradigmatic shift here. It's not just ecologists, it's ecology. In the development community, ecology is a barrier. Like, we do our plans and, oh, there's all that nature stuff will get in the way. We don't think of nature as a resource. We think of it as a receptor of all the bad things. So this perception of nature is wrong, and perception of ecologists as implementers of barriers stems from it. So we need to shift to a functional approach, understanding nature functionally. I've rabbited on about this before, but thinking of functions, services, benefits to people, and not just the rights of the owners of a physical asset. To do that, systems science is absolutely fundamental. I'm really pleased to hear, Ed, about the integration of ecology into multiple programs at Exeter, and I think the siloing of education doesn't serve us well, hasn't served us well. Equally, the siloing of journals does tend to stifle that systems thinking, so we need to deal with that. But it's not just the quality of sort of the integration of functional approaches into science. Above all, it's into extension services. Now, you know, going back to the 60s, we had good extension services, particularly with respect to agriculture and that sort of thing, to implement developing science into practice. We decided that wasn't a good idea. We stopped investing taxpayer money. So we've created barriers between the knowledge we generate and its practical implementation. And the good old 1980s, 1990s PUS, public understanding of science, didn't help us at all, because that was just scientists shouting a bit louder to people who didn't understand. So actually, we do need a practical interpretation or knowledge transfer function to bring this functional approach into practice. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing in relation to embedding science and evidence into our approach is really the end game. We need a systemic politic. You know, I worked in the government sector for 22 years, and it is deeply siloed. A lot of good people in it who are frustrated, but the system itself has impermeable firewalls between departments and the budgets that go with them. Now, I worked a bit on the Natural Choice White Paper 2011. Many of us might remember that. And we put into that fundamentally embedding the values of nature across policy areas. And a decade later, we've made marginal progress. Yet we have good exemplars of things we've done, integrated constructed wetlands and all the rest of it that are designed for multifunctional output. But the regulatory system that falls from the political system is still siloed, so getting them consented is highly problematic. So de-siloing our policy framework is absolutely fundamental. How do we do that? I mean, you know, I talked about the white paper I worked on and a few other bits and bobs at a political level. It hasn't happened. Why not? I think we've lacked the tools. Now, I co-developed a Ramsar resolution for the Rapid Assessment of Wetland Ecosystem Services, RAWS approach, which is a systemic framework to think about wetlands. And it was based on other work I'd done on various other habitats and development contexts and so forth. So we're developing the tools to do that. We need also systemic economic tools. In another hat, I've worked on campaigning on large dams around the tropical world. And there, the cost benefit is largely £1 million of concrete produces 2 million pounds of water and 2 million pounds worth of energy. So it's a 4-to-1 benefit to cost. Actually, no one accounts for the systemic ramifications of changing catchment functions.
Mark, I'm just conscious of time here. So one final point.
Well, I mean, that was coming to the final point. We need a systemic way to look at benefits and disbenefits, beneficiaries and victims, in terms of the way we do the economics that then supports the integration across policy areas. I'll shut up.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much. And we've got just a handful of minutes left. Tom, over to you for some final thoughts. This is a lot to think about, but embedding science and evidence in our approach and thoughts on everything else we've been discussed. All yours.
There's a lot there, isn't there? I'm going to say one thing about science and evidence and leave it at that. So we have been using science and evidence for a long time in ecology. We do that. And that's a lot of what's led to the incredible work to look at bats and newts and whatever else it might be that's protected. What we haven't done is use a whole different set of evidence that we need to understand that functionality at an ecosystem level. And so it's not just about whether we're using it, whether we're using science and technology, it's what science and technology we're using. And in my view, the role of the ecologist is dramatically changing from a consultancy's point of view, from someone that says no to, no, you can't do this because of newts, or no, you can't do that because of bats, or we'd have to do A, B, and C before you did anything, to one that's actually starting to talk about the ecosystem as a whole and how that plays out in terms of flood relief, in terms of air quality, in terms of access to green space, as well as the bats and the newts and so on, in an integrated way. That's a completely different role, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, nice.
Thank you, Tom. And what a great way to end our session together. We have covered a lot of ground today. I think we all feel much more prepared now, of course, for COP26, which starts on the 1st of November. I expect to hear a lot more from all of you, I think, over the coming weeks and months on these topics, and we'll be following closely. I'd like to thank the IES for bringing us together, Ethne Childs for all her hard work in the background and bringing us together, but of course, to thank the four of you, Mark Everard, Tim Goodwin, Stewart Cocker, and Tom Butterworth for taking the time to be with us this morning. It's been a pleasure. I'm going to go and digest all this over the weekend, hopefully on a Cornish beach if the weather isn't like it's been all week. I wish you all a happy weekend as well, and looking forward to hearing from you very, very soon. So thank you so much, and over to you, Ethne.